Welcome to How to Become a Production SQL Database Administrator. My name is Raphael. In the previous video, we looked at the SQL Profiler tool, and I gave you an introduction as to how to navigate through the graphical tool and gave you some of the pointers of what the capabilities of SQL Profiler are and does. In this video, I'm going to be looking at this question and identifying what is causing the slow queries in a production environment. Now, you will execute this particular trace when users complain that when they execute a certain command, it's taking too long to retrieve data. So this is a clear example of using the SQL Profiler and trying to figure out which queries are causing a tremendous amount of time. Now, in terms of time, that obviously depends on the environment that you work in. The question becomes, what is acceptable in data retrieval in terms of duration of time? If I execute a command and it's taking 10 seconds to retrieve data, or it's taking 20 seconds or 1 second or 1 minute, what is the acceptable duration of retrieval of data for your company? So if you determine that when the user executes a query and the retrieval database should be within like 1 or 2 seconds, then anything bordering 10 seconds or above obviously is a factor to be determined. So this is what we're going to do right now. So I'm going to navigate to the SQL server. As you can see here now, which I did previously, is here I've got a select command from the peoples table for 100,000 rows. And I already tested it and it took 1 second. Then I did 200,000 rows and that took 2 seconds, 300,000 rows, 4 seconds, 7, 9, and so on. Right up to where I did up to 3 million rows, and that took 40 seconds. So what I'm going to try to do now is try to determine which of these commands is taking the longest. Now, obviously, as you can see, we know that visibly because we can see that. But what I'm going to do now is execute the following. So I'm going to actually run SQL Profiler and then execute some of these commands. So go to Tools, and let's open the Profiler. And now we're going to use a built-in template. Let's connect. And we're going to call it, let's just call it duration. And we're going to select the template for TSQL duration. Now I'll save it later after the execution. If you go to the event selections, you'll show these are the events. Primarily, it's going to trace all the SQL stored procedures, if there are any, and the SQL batches that we'll be executing. Regarding the tables that it's going to collect, or columns, I should say, it's going to take the duration, the text data, SPADE by default, and then binary data. We can uncheck that since we don't need that. This, as I mentioned, if you try, you cannot, so that is not by default. This obviously is important because we want to know which select statement or which statements is causing the long duration. So, and these obviously we do need. Now, the other thing is I'm going to actually execute this first and then look at it if you run, and I'm going to go over it again. So I'm going to execute this, and you'll see there's no data running. Now I'm going to go back to SQL. I'm going to minimize this so we can see simultaneously. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to execute a few. So we know this one took 10 seconds right here. So I'm going to select all those and I'm going to execute it. And as soon as I execute it, you'll see now those very select statements that are processing. And since right here, since it's also capturing the comments uncommented, we can actually physically see how long it's taking to execute that command. But right here, notice that the duration is in thousandths of a second or a millionth millisecond. Now, one thing to note is that when SQL Server manages this, it captures the data in a millisecond, which is a thousandth of a second, as you can see. And then you'll see that when I save this data to a table, this will change actually from a thousandth to a millionth. So we'll have to do some little conversions, but I'll show you that. So now that the has been executed, we can see these. We can stop the trace here. And now what I want to do now is, now that I've captured the data, actually I want to now retrieve it to a table. So I'm going to go File, Save As. I'm going to save it to a table. connect. I'm going to go to SQL2. I'm going to call this duration as a table. I'm going to go OK. And now that data is saved as a table. So I can go and we can actually close this now. We don't need this. We don't even need this anymore. And let's go back to an environment here. If I expand the SQL database, expand the tables, and refresh the tables, I should see the data called table called duration, and there it is. So now I'm going to do a select statement. Let's do the top 1,000 rows. And as you'll notice that, so now I can do analysis against this data. And remember what I told you that the SQL server, the SQL Profiler, when it's recording the duration, it does in milliseconds, which is 1,000 somethings, but it displays in millionth of a second. So as you can see, these are in millions now. So what we may have to do is convert this. So the first thing I want to do is when you capture this, now obviously for our demonstration purposes, we only had a few select statements and a few connectivities, but in a real production environment, you may get tons and tons of data. So ideally what you want to do is write a select statement to filter the data that you're interested in. And in this case, I don't want the null values. So I don't want these columns, I don't want this column, I don't want this column, and I don't want this. All I want basically is to retrieve this data. And the way we can do that is simply writing a select statement. So if I go back here, and I've actually written one, and there it is. So it's select duration. Remember, it's going to be in the 100, so I'm going to divide it by 1,000,000, duration in seconds, from that table. And now I'm going to filter by text data. So if you can see here, basically I want to just filter by select. Now yours may be slightly different, so you may have to modify your where statement. But I want to say I want everything where you can see the select statement. And since I know that of the 10 rows, columns 4 through 8 of select statement, I'll omit these. So let's see if that works. So now if I run this and execute it, you'll see that I have the data. And one thing to notice here, as I mentioned, this is the duration in millionth. It's giving you a millionth value. And I've used this quick division here to give you in seconds. And we know it took 1 second, 2 seconds, 4 seconds, 11 seconds, and 14 seconds. And now I can manipulate data more here and say, give me, so now that I know which queries were taking a longer time, I can start filtering. If I'm not concerned with 1 second, then this query itself, whatever it may be, is irrelevant to our analysis, so we can omit that. But obviously these two queries, where we're selecting more than 800,000 and 700,000, these are obviously of significance. So you start looking at these promises, and now you're going to take this actually file and then put it into what's called a DTA, which is a database tuning advisor. And maybe we can tune this data better. Now, obviously, we can tune this immediately by looking at the asterisk. Obviously, for our demonstration purposes, I've used the asterisk, which means I'm going to select all the columns. In a production environment, you would not do that. So the filtering of columns would certainly reduce this duration longer, because there would be less columns to retrieve. So that's one of them. But let's say that's not the case, then obviously we'll look into the further. But now as you can see, that this is a great way of trying to determine which queries are taking a long time to execute. So now let's go back to here, and let's kill this one right here. And now, so one thing you'll notice is that I do have data retrieval for millisecond of 1 second, of 2 second, and 4 second. Now, obviously, in a production environment, if there was anything less than 10 seconds, for example, here, you're going to get hundreds of thousands of rows, or hundreds of rows, or thousands of rows, and we don't want to filter that. So what we ideally want to do when we're writing this is to filter the duration and say, I don't want any text data or any statements less than, let's say, 4 seconds. So we only want to retrieve now these 2 seconds. And that you can do in the SQL Profiler also. So now I'm going to go to the Tools, SQL Profiler. And now what I'm going to do essentially is use the same template, but this time I'm going to, let's look at that. This time I'm going to uncheck this. This time I'm going to filter the data and say I don't want any data coming in that's less than 4 seconds. So I'm going to go to column filters, and I'm going to click on duration, and I'm going to say greater than or equal to. In this case, I do not want anything less than 4 seconds, so I'm going to put 4,000. Remember, here we determine by millionth, the thousandth. In the execution of it in a table, it'll display it in a million. So this displays anything greater than or 4 seconds. So anything under, any queries that are taking less than 4 seconds will not be displayed. So let me repeat that. When you filter this by duration, this is basically stating, give me all the queries that are not taking less than 4 seconds. So now if I go, okay, that's filtered, and okay. And now if I run it, obviously I haven't run anything. But now if I run this, you'll notice that obviously I've got queries for 100,000, queries for 200,000, queries for 3, 4, or 7, 8, and these are running. These queries should not appear because they're taking less than 4,000. So anything greater than 4 I should do. So let's actually look at some of the queries around 1 million. So if I execute this now and execute it, go back to my SQL Server or Profiler, you'll see that even though the trace is running and the first queries have been executed, they're not actually being shown up because it's less than 4 seconds. Here is duration is 4 seconds. This is actually just the syntax that is copying, but it's actually giving me anything less than 4 seconds is not displaying, and that's what we want. So now we've filtered the result set for the duration, and we've said give us anything, all the data, all the select statements, or all the text values against the database that are greater than 4 seconds. And now we can obviously do an analysis here. So this is one way of narrowing your filters also. Because as I said, when you have SQL Server, and if you don't filter it by duration, you're going to get thousands upon thousands of text data retrieval data because everything takes less than a second or less than a millisecond. So this is one way to do it. Now I think this is going to be it. And that's it. So now you can see, and again, I can dump this to a table and start analyzing it and looking at those queries that are taking longer than 4 queries. I can start optimizing those. And optimizing queries is another lesson that we'll be talking about. But now you get an idea of how to use that template called duration. And this is one of the key things that you will be doing in a production environment, and that's to determine which queries are taking way too long. And this is one way to determine that, and it's completed here. So I think I'll leave it there. I think I've illustrated the point. This one is identifying which queries are taking too long, how to execute them using the SQL Profiler, and trying to determine which queries are taking too long, group them, and filter them by duration time. And then you can start doing the analysis. So I think I'm going to leave it there. And my name is Raphael, and this is how to become a production SQL database administrator. See you in the next video.